This. Hi there, good afternoon. This is Jeff Kassman with the second edition of Welcome to Tradition, the series that my partner and I, Jim DePiante, are doing to welcome people to tradition. And there are a lot of issues that we're going to cover for folks, whether they're coming to the traditional Latin Mass for the first time, or they've been to a couple of different locations and maybe they've seen some different things and now they're wondering, well, what's the right thing to do? Jim and I are going to get into those issues for you today. And so welcome to the call, Jim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So a couple of the things that we need to talk about is we need to back up just a little bit and address those issues from last week. We covered a lot of ground last week, and so as a result, we had a lot of questions that we need to get into. So first, just a quick review on what we talked about last week. If you've not watched that video, you should go do that now. We talked about basic principles for gestures and postures, things like bowing. There's a right way and there's a wrong way. And we talked about folding hands and why it's important to do it a certain way. We talked about making the sign of the cross, and that does seem simple, but there's a lot to learn there, both about the theology and the background of it, and also the importance of unity in our conduct at the liturgy. We also talked about striking your breast, when to do that, how to do it, when not to do it, and so forth. All right, so Jim, we have an agreed upon outline, but I'm going to throw you a curveball.
I'm ready.
We had a little bit of hate mail from our first episode.
Oh dear.
A couple of women wanted to know why they should listen to two old white guys. So,
Question.
Yeah. So, what do you have to say to that?
Well, the fact that that we're older is actually meaningful in this context. We older folks have some direct experience with tradition, and we have a certain wisdom that a younger individual is a little less likely to have, and that's by the grace of God, obviously. But we bring that to the table. We bring that to bear on the question, and what we're talking about is tradition. And my experience with tradition is firsthand. This was taught to me by people who knew nothing of the Novus Ordo at the time. So that brings with it a certain credibility. Why guys? Well, in the scheme of things, that's because God really did intend for men to take the lead on this kind of thing. And Jeff, you and I are not two who would ever shirk that responsibility. So ladies, we love you and we hope you can learn from us. And we hope that you can learn without any bitterness or any sense of acrimony, because we have a lot to teach. We're both fairly experienced in this kind of thing, and we have the benefit of wisdom and experience. So, and we bring that to you as a gift.
Yeah, fair enough. So I think there is a kind of a proper ordering of things within the family, whether that's just your immediate family or kind of the extended family of the human race. But also too, I know that my wife is a very intelligent woman and has studied the faith very intensely, does not want to expose herself to the kinds of criticism and attacks that are, let's face it, pretty common these days. If you're a Catholic, certainly if you're a traditional Catholic, God forbid you're a white man professing these things, it can be pretty nasty. And she doesn't want to expose herself to that. Your wife's pretty old-fashioned, conservative, traditional. I imagine she doesn't want any part of that either.
No, she found something better to do today.
Yeah. Okay, one more hate mail, and then we'll get into the questions. So there was a guy who expressed a certain dismay that maybe we don't really know what we're talking about. We don't seem to have experience with the disabled or the sick or the old. Well, certainly you've got experience with old people or with children. And so all of these things that we're talking about regarding the precision of gestures and how to bow and when to that maybe we don't have a broad enough understanding of what people are really dealing with at the liturgy to talk about this. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's a gratuitous assertion. It has no basis in reality. I have personally, and I'm sure you do, and given we don't get to this age without having a fair amount of experience with a very broad cross-section of life. Jeff, you and I have both lived in foreign countries. We've lived amongst people who are relatively poor, considered to the standard of living that we have in our country. I'm sure that you've been among the disabled. There's a fundamental principle in law that says when you make law for the exception, generally that's bad law, that the law is intended to treat the general case, and then you make exceptions for the exceptional case. So the liturgy is quite clear in what must be done, even to the point, in fact, where a priest who, as St. Isaac Jogues did, I believe it was the Iroquois, gnawed his fingers off. And he actually wrote, he had to get a dispensation from Rome to say Holy Mass because he could not say Mass according to the rubrics. So we treat the exceptions, but the law, the rules, the regulations, the precepts are written for the general case, not for the exception. So,
and I think we all know that if you're sick, if you are disabled, if you have had your right arm amputated, if you are pregnant and are unable to perform all of the functions, genuflect, for example, or something, you're dispensed from the strict application of the law. You get to focus on the interior posture more so. So I don't think that we need to go into that a whole lot. Do you?
No.
Okay, great. So let's jump right into the first question. So last week we were talking about, and this is a pet peeve for me as well, I know it is for you, the striking of the breast. And let's just quickly review what's behind the striking of our breast. We do it like this, or we do it like this. What's behind the striking of the breast? Why do we do that? You kind of created a bit of a stir, so I want to get back into this.
Sure. So Saint Jerome, who was very, very close to this kind of thing exactly, and very well versed in not just the language, but the culture. So that we strike our breast because the breast is the seat of evil thoughts. And so we do that to dispel these thoughts and purify our hearts. So it's not a penitential gesture. It's not intended to cause us pain. Rather, it's intended to remind us of our sinfulness. And this is paramount, the need for God's mercy. So I did do considerable searching to see if there was any credible evidence that was related to the flagellants in the Old or New Testament. Didn't find any. Of course, it's impossible to prove the negative, but it is very clearly stated, and by more than just Saint Jerome, that the purpose of it is to in a sense, castigate ourselves, but not punish ourselves, to remind ourselves of the need for God's mercy.
And so one of the more controversial things that you said was the striking of your breast during the Hail, Holy Queen. Those words at the end, most clement, most loving,
Sweet Virgin Mary.
Right. And so I took special note this Sunday, and sure enough, the majority of the people that I witnessed were in fact doing that. Obviously, their intentions are good. They seek to do the right thing. They see other people doing it, so they imitate that. So what do you think? Are you out of line here, criticizing people who are just trying to express their passionate zeal for Our Lady?
Um, I have the habit as well, I confess. I was taught to do this. I was taught to do this. But we have to keep in mind the principles. And so we talked about 4 principles of liturgical gestures. First, they have meaning. Second, we worship with what is spiritual in us, the intellect, the soul, but also with our bodies. And we do that in a prescribed way. And the reason those things are prescribed is for the unity that you speak of. And when we conform to that, we do that in a spirit of humility and obedience, which makes a simple gesture that we might or might not want to do, but now we do it out of obedience. And all the saints have told us countless times, the smallest thing that we do in a spirit of obedience can be more meritorious than the greatest thing that we do, because it pleases us. So when we do it inappropriately, it's inconsistent with the meaning of the gesture. And unfortunately, the effect of that is to implicitly teach people that it doesn't have a meaning. So if every time you ever saw a priest or a layman striking his breast at the words, "My Jesus, mercy, have mercy on us, miserere nobis," you would soon always associate that with the need for mercy. Now we associate the meaning with the gesture. Right now, I assure you, if you ask most people, why do we do this? They would say, I really don't know. And how would they? So it's contrary to a spirit of humility and obedience, but it also creates an ambiguity. And ambiguity in any form of communication is the enemy. Now, it's been asserted that isn't that Pharisaical to be more worried about the letter of the law than the spirit of the law? We're not told to not follow the letter of the law. We're enjoined to not follow the letter of the law when it comes at the expense of the spirit of the law. But we should follow the letter of the law. And I will give you a beautiful example of following the letter of the law with the intended spirit of the law. In the time of our Lord, when he was born, it was the practice, it was the old law that a woman would go to the temple to be purified after she had a child, 40 days after a son. Our Lady had no need for purification. She was perfect.
Yeah, we're talking about February 2nd in our calendar, right? February 2nd, the purification of Our Lady. And so anyway, continue, please, just so everybody understands on the calendar when you see that it's 40 days from Christmas, and she followed that law even though she didn't have
to the letter, even to the point of, because she was considered poor, to her offering that she made. Now to buy back the Redeemer. This is nuts. She made an offering, the purpose of which is literally to buy back, in the old law, to buy back the child. Our Lord did not need to be bought back. He was the one who would buy back all of us. And yet she did it. She followed the spirit of the law, but the letter of the law, but did it in conformance with the spirit of the law. So,
and I think
to do likewise.
Right. And I think that this point about, okay, it's a good gesture, but that doesn't mean we just do it all of the time. It sends the wrong signal. It loses its meaning. It's like using your turn signal while you're driving down the interstate, right? It has no meaning. It actually is kind of a distraction and it's confusing. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, we had a number of questions about, okay, Uncle Jim, when is it that we should strike our breasts during Mass? Are you prepared to kind of give us the definitive, here are the 4 occasions when we would do it? Be very specific.
Sure enough. So the Confiteor is recited customarily 3 times during the Mass. First the priest, then the lay people, then the lay people a second time. The servers on behalf of the lay people. So we do it for the Confiteor of the faithful at mea culpa, mea maxima culpa 3 times. But we don't do it for the priest's Confiteor. We do it during the Agnus Dei. We told the Cantamundi, miserere nobis, miserere nobis, miserere nobis, dona nobis pacem. We do it during the Domine non sum dignus of the faithful. So when the priest turns around and says, Ecce tolit peccata mundi, Domine non sum dignus, 3 times. but not for his communion. And then we do it during the Leonine prayers after Mass, after a low Mass, Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us 3 times. So those are times when we do.
You raised a point I want to return to, which kind of in a crazy way is a controversial issue. The second Confiteor is not really prescribed in the 1962, as I understand it. It was prescribed in the pre-55. So for people who are new to tradition, the liturgy was updated a number of times over the years. It didn't just happen, at the Council of Trent, and that was it. It didn't just happen after the Second Vatican Council. There's been what we would call, Jim, I think you would agree, organic development, authentic development, like adding St. Joseph to the prayers of the Mass. So prior to 1962, under the so-called pre-55 rules, there was a second Confiteor that was performed by the servers, but in the 62 it's not prescribed. So you might go some places and not see that happening. Do you want to comment on that just very briefly?
Sure. It's not in the 1962 missal published by Angelus Press. I have every place I've been at an SSPX Mass, it has been done. And Marcel Lefebvre addressed this explicitly and said it's a pious custom that the people find difficult to let go of, and it's not wrong. In fact, I was always taught the last thing you do before you receive Holy Communion is make an act of contrition. That is the point of the second Confiteor, because on the likelihood that we might have sinned by inattention or whatever between the first Confiteor and the second, we want to be absolved of those sins so that we're in the most pure state possible before we receive Holy Communion. And so Marcel Lefebvre acknowledged that this was worth permitting. There are a very few other things that are not in the 62 liturgy, mostly with respect to Holy Week, that he conceded could and should be permitted without being a violation of the liturgy.
So if you're going to a diocesan Mass, if you're going to a fraternity Mass or an institute Mass, and you don't see this because maybe they're following the older tradition, that's okay, certainly. Don't be worried about the liturgy. There's nothing that stops you from doing that yourself.
In fact, you should do it yourself.
Absolutely, you should prepare. Okay, so you've just given us some examples of when we should strike our breast. When are a few times during the Mass when we should not strike our breast, when it's not really appropriate?
During the celebrant's Confiteor, when Father says nobis quoque peccatoribus, we don't. That's his prayer. He's praying for us, nobis, but that's his prayer. And so he does, we don't. We don't during the celebrant's Domine non sum dignus. And this is interesting. No one does during the Agnus Dei et Requiem Mass, because instead of saying miserere nobis, we say dona eis requiem. Dona eis requiem sempiternam. So Lord, grant him rest, grant him eternal rest. There's nothing in that speaks of mercy or sinfulness. And so it's inappropriate. And in fact, the rubrics for the priest explicitly say that you don't he does not strike his breast.
But outside of Mass, is it ever appropriate to strike your breast?
Just not during the Hail Holy Queen. Certainly, the prayer to St. Michael at home, Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us. A lot of people say the Confiteor as part of their personal prayers. It's absolutely appropriate. If you're at home on a Sunday and you can't make it to Mass and you recite the prayers at the Mass, it's fitting to strike your breast at any time when you would normally strike your breast during the Mass. So absolutely.
So there are going to be some litanies where it would be appropriate. Anytime there's a basically Lord have mercy on me kind of sentiment being expressed in a litany, right?
Yes and no. The church really is sensible. So every litany starts out with invocations, the response to which is miserere nobis. It's not fitting, but it's also not prescribed. there are also litanies. So the responses to the litanies are either miserere nobis or ora pro nobis. It's absolutely not fitting for ora pro nobis ever, under any circumstances. It's not prescribed for miserere nobis, but at least it's not fitting. All right. Then at the end of the of all litanies, we have the Agnus Dei, and then Parce Nobis Domine, etc. It's also not prescribed there. Now, here's an interesting thing to know. There's only one litany that's liturgical, and that's the Litany of the Saints. All the others are private prayer, private devotions. The Litany of the Saints does actually prescribe only at one point that we strike our breasts, and that's Peccatores te rogamus audi nos, at that. And only at that phrase where it's actually prescribed. That took some research to find all of that out.
That's great. We appreciate it. Okay, so let's move on. We also talked about the sign of the cross. And we'll see sometimes people making the sign of the cross 3 times. Is that an Eastern thing? Should they be doing it that way? We'll talk about that a little bit.
So 3 important distinctions that we touched on for Eastern Catholics. One is how they hold their hand. The other is right shoulder first. And the other is 3 times. Not sure exactly where it came from, but it's very much true in Mexico that they'll make 3 signs of the cross very, very rapidly. And that's a cultural thing. It's not fitting liturgically. It's perfectly fine outside of a liturgical context. There's another very interesting thing that you see among Hispanics, also among Italians, and that is they'll kiss their thumb afterwards. So the what you see happening is they will make a cross, thumb over forefinger, and then kiss that cross when they're done. It's also a cultural thing. It's not wrong, but in the interest of uniformity and that spirit of humble obedience, to simply make it the way the church prescribes. What you do at home is a different matter entirely. But even so, if you do it in that same spirit at home, it can be more meritorious.
Well, what about, since we're on the issue, we might as well just address it. What about when Eastern Catholics are in a Latin environment? Should they do as the Latins do? And what about us Romans when we're in an Eastern environment? And that's happening a lot. I have some good friends that they attend a Byzantine liturgy on a regular basis because that's close to them, and it's a respectful apostolic liturgy. Should they be emulating the Easterns while they're in that environment?
It brings up a very interesting thing. So we've all heard this saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. A lot of people don't know where that originated. So St. Ambrose was the mentor, St. Augustine. And he had to go say Mass in Rome. And so he said, what do I do when I get there? And the response was, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So that applies. When you're on somebody else's territory, you do as they do. So a Latin going to an Eastern Catholic Mass should follow their customs. An Easterner coming to Latin Mass should follow their customs. And that's just, again, for that precious uniformity, but it's also a gesture of cultural respect. Absolutely.
And there's, we talked about modesty last time. Modesty is not just wearing clothes, right? It's not just wearing clothes that cover certain parts of the body. It's following what's appropriate at a certain place and certain time. So if I go to the divine liturgy and they stand to receive communion, which every Eastern liturgy I've ever been to, they receive communion standing. It would be inappropriate for a Latin to kneel down and kind of create a spectacle in that situation, right? Okay, so let's continue on. Sign of the cross at the gospel. So what's happening there? And let's talk about the first gospel, and let's talk about the last gospel, if you see any distinction. What do we do there? How do we do it?
Okay, so following similar principles, Father will first sign the book with a small cross. Then he will sign himself. And the way that one does that is also liturgically prescribed. And so you see people often do this, where they'll sign themselves with this. It's actually done with a flat palm, and it's actually prescribed the meat of the thumb. And as you do this, you recite to yourself, may the Lord be in my mind, on my lips, and in my heart. As simple as that. And so that's done when Father announces the gospel, and you'll see he'll do it. And you do that in unison with him. He actually doesn't say those words, not precisely, but that's what you say. May the Lord be on my mind, on my lips, and in my heart. And then the last gospel, same thing. It's a gospel. And so we ask, we make that same petition.
And what about the sign of the cross during the Glory Be? Whether it's, so let's talk about a couple of applications. We've got the Gloria that's said during the Mass, and then we've got the Glory Be that's maybe said during the Rosary, for example. Can you address those points?
Sure. So it's not so difficult in the Gloria in Excelsis. Because there isn't a point where you simply recite one after the other the names of the three persons of the Trinity. The Gloria in Excelsis is referred to as the major doxology, doxology being a hymn of praise to the Trinity, or a saint in union with the Trinity. The minor doxology is the Gloria Patri, Glory Be. And the Trinity is called out by name, glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Ghost. A bow is absolutely not fitting. I mean, a sign of the cross. What is fitting is a bow. Any doxology, you make a bow. So glory be, as a matter of fact, I did it rather habitually just now. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning. And then you become erect after you say that invocation of the persons of the Trinity.
And that's because of the solemnity of it all, the dignity of the persons to whom we're addressing this prayer, referring to is that's the bow. What about during the Rosary? Very common to see at people say that Glory Be at the end of the mystery, and they're doing the sign of the cross. Yes or no?
Not if you want to conform to what the church suggests that we do. It's just not fitting, because what we're doing at that point is not signing ourselves with the cross. We're glorifying the Trinity, and those are two very different gestures with very different meaning. And again, if you want your children to, if you want to hand on the right thing to your children, then if they see you doing this at inappropriate times, they're not going to have any understanding of what's going on. We call it the sign of the cross, but do we really reflect on the fact that we're signing ourselves with the cross? And if they don't see you bow slightly, but instead see you make the sign of the cross, you haven't imparted to them the significance of these gestures. So they don't understand. They don't see intuitively, wow, every single time my mom and dad say the name of Jesus, they bow their heads. And every time they invoke the Trinity, they bow. That makes a lasting impression. When you muddy this up with ambiguity, you're not communicating what the church wants us to communicate with these gestures. And remember, the first principle of a gesture is it has meaning. And so when you dilute that meaning, you're doing a disservice to, well, certainly to those who would see you, and maybe even to yourself.
One more question on this before we move on. There's also a tradition or a custom in much of Latin America to do the sign of the cross when you're passing a church. And if you're in Mexico City and you're in a taxi, your taxi driver is crossing himself constantly because there's a church, a big old cathedral in every corner. What do you think about that custom?
It's laudable. It's beautiful. It is merely more apparent in Catholic Mexico, but every Catholic, I was certainly taught as a lad, every time you heard a siren, an ambulance siren, you crossed yourself. Every time you passed in front of a church, you crossed yourself. And it was just instinctive. I still do it. I don't even think about it. I hear a siren. just invoking God's blessing on the poor, unfortunate soul who is possibly injured. So yeah, it's just more apparent in very Catholic countries, but it's absolutely a Catholic custom from time immemorial.
Great. All right, last topic for today. Let's talk about genuflecting. This is another one where whether you started in the Novus Ordo and you've come to tradition, whether you started as a Protestant and you've converted, you're probably seeing all sorts of different things being done. And when you go to different places, you see different things being done. So let's work through this. Where does genuflecting fall in the big scheme of things?
So genuflection falls within the category first of a reverence. And if you consider what the reverences are, we have the reverence of kissing an object, or the reverence that those in sacred order show each other at a solemn mass where they bestow the kiss of peace on each other. So that's a reverence. But for us faithful, the sort of the hierarchy of reverences, least significant, I'll say, the head bow, then the moderate bow, then the profound bow, then the genuflection, then the double genuflection, then the full prostration, which happens very, very seldom in the Latin Church. And this reverence of genuflection is done principally to the Blessed Sacrament. There are other instances we'll get to in a minute.
Okay, so let's talk about working our way down or up the ladder of solemnity of the genuflection. When is a single genuflection made, and how is it properly done?
So first, how it's done, probably the most important advice I could give you is stop. You don't make it on the fly. So you stop, you put your feet together, and you simply bring your right knee next to your left heel. That's that. Two things you don't do because they're not fitting. You don't make the sign of the cross. It's a different gesture. So you muddy the waters when you bless yourself, when what you're doing is actually showing a reverence to the Blessed Sacrament. You also don't bow in a single genuflection. So that's the single. When do you do that? When you enter within view of the Blessed Sacrament reposed. Okay. Now we can talk, in a minute, let's talk about when you do that and the distinction between when you do a double and when you do a single genuflection. Continue.
You're coming into, we got a lot of questions on this. So I think we got to dive into it and be methodical. Right. You're coming into the church. The Blessed Sacrament is in the tabernacle. Reposed. Perhaps it's before Mass, which is probably going to be in most cases. Lots of questions about when and where specifically to genuflect. People are genuflecting the moment they come through the doors. People are genuflecting at the pew, maybe both, right? Talk about that. What's appropriate? And again, I think there's going to be some Eastern things here. You know, everybody's kind of interested in the Eastern Church because they're exotic and they're, right, it's different, you know, so it's easy to, you know, be interested in that. Plus we have so many crises in our church that lots of people are looking to East. So that's why we're addressing these questions, folks, for the Eastern people. So come into the church. Are we genuflecting at the door as soon as we come in?
Again, the principle is when we come in view of the Blessed Sacrament, and that can be either when it's reserved or when it's exposed. So either reposed or reserved, or exposed. So in the tabernacle or put out for viewing. We genuflect when we come in view of it. But if everybody did that as soon as they were coming in the door of the church, there was a lot of traffic, you'd have a traffic jam back there. And so it's just the church is terribly sensible. And so it's reasonable that you hold off until really your last opportunity. And that's before you get in your pew. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that it's a rule that you have to get genuflect before you get in your pew. That's actually not the case. The rule is you genuflect when you come in view of the Blessed Sacrament, be it reserved or exposed, single versus double genuflection.
I once heard a friend, a priest, trying to simplify this concept. Let me run it by you. He said, that in the course of coming to Mass, there might be a number of movements that you make, liturgical movements, not formally, but you're coming to your pew, maybe you go to the confessional, maybe you've taken a kid out and you're coming back, or maybe you've had to go to the bathroom. There's all sorts of stuff happening, at least in my experience, and especially when there's lots of children involved. His principle was, when you come closest to our Lord in the tabernacle, that should kind of be a guiding principle. So if you're going to make this long winding trip around the church with your kid because you had to get out of a pew and you got to go a certain way and all this sort of thing, his principle was, wherever you're coming closest to the tabernacle, and if that's at the pew, as it oftentimes is,
typically would be, right,
that would be
that's the time to genuflect.
That would be the case. Okay.
And by the way, the same principle holds when you walk across the front of the church. Your closest point of approach is when you're dead center and now in view of the Blessed Sacrament. So you turn, you genuflect, and then you keep going on your way. Right?
Yes. Now, I've seen something recently which I'd never seen before. People going back and forth to communion are genuflecting in the process. They're genuflecting when they come out of the pew. They're going up to the rail. They're kneeling down to receive communion. They're coming back. They're genuflecting again at the pew. What do you think?
It's not fitting. You're going to receive the Blessed Sacrament. The Blessed Sacrament is, after half a dozen communions are distributed, the Blessed Sacrament's walking all around the church in the mouths of people, and Father's holding it on the altar. But you have something to do, and you've already paid your reverence to the Blessed Sacrament. Now you need to go receive him. And by the way, it's just absolutely not fitting ever under any circumstances to genuflect when you have the Blessed Sacrament immediately within yourself. So, and there is a practical consideration. You've got to move a lot of people through. So no, it's not fitting to genuflect, going to communion, returning from communion. I'll also say that the principle for a double genuflection is to genuflect on two knees when you come in view of the Blessed Sacrament exposed. And people have the habit of doing so. And the non-existent rule is, after the consecration, before the Blessed Sacrament is put back in the tabernacle and the door is closed, we do a double genuflection. That's not the case. And it's pretty convincing when you consider that when the priest is holding the Blessed Sacrament in his hands, getting ready to elevate it, before and after, he does a single genuflection. It's just not fitting to do double genuflection because the Blessed Sacrament is not exposed. It's on the altar, but it's not out for exposition in front of the people. And that's when you make a double genuflection.
Raising another question about when the Blessed Sacrament is exposed. I've seen people, again, a very Mexican custom. If they need to leave the church for some reason while the Blessed Sacrament is exposed, they are walking backwards out of the church. I think that they're attempting to show respect and adoration to the God who's on display there on the altar.
It's sensible. It's a social thing. There's nothing in the rubrics. In fact, the rubrics for the servers and for the priest insist, if you must make way for the priest to pass at some point, is permitted to take a step backwards, but otherwise you never walk backwards. It's just absolutely not permitted. But there's also a principle that says you don't turn your back on the Blessed Sacrament, but that principle applies in very specific circumstances when the Blessed Sacrament is on the altar for the priest and the servers or ministers on the altar. But even then, at times, they must turn their back on the Blessed Sacrament. We have things to do. We have work to do. We have to get from the front of the church to the back of the church. So it's a pious custom, but there's nothing in liturgical rubrics that say that should be done.
And if you're in a large church or a large cathedral and the Blessed Sacrament is exposed in the altar way up there, and you've got to make your, a long way back, I guess I want to give people comfort that you're not showing disrespect to our Lord. If you exit your pew, you do the double genuflection, and then you turn around so that you can proceed out. That's not an act of disrespect, right?
No, it's sensible.
Yeah. Okay. What about the supposed custom of genuflecting on the left knee for meeting a bishop? A lot of traditionalists, they're new to tradition. That's what this is all about. They're going to have occasions to meet a bishop, whether it's the diocesan ordinary or someone else. They want to do the right thing. They want to show respect to this successor of the apostles, and they're aware that most people are oblivious to that. They're not doing it. What's the right thing to do?
Oh dear. Oh dear. All right. So imagine you go to a party that's far away from your hometown. And so you're in some other diocese other than your own. And there are 3 bishops, and you're going to go meet the 3 of them. One of them is your bishop, but remember, you're in a different diocese. The other is a bishop of the Society of St. Pius X, and the other is the bishop of that diocese. What do you do? Okay. Your bishop in somebody else's diocese is not your authority in that diocese. And so he merits simply a kiss on his ring. He does not merit a genuflection on either knee. Society of St. Pius X bishops are auxiliary bishops. They don't have ordinary jurisdiction anywhere in the world, and so they never merit a genuflection. And I know that's going to be, people are going to have a problem with that, but that's true. Now you say, yes, but I do remember I kissed Bishop Fillet's ring while I genuflected on my left knee, and he didn't say a thing. That's because he's gracious. That's all. He's not going to say, I'll tell you that's a mistake, but he's not going to tell you that's a mistake. All right. So the principle, we honor the bishop for 2 reasons, one for his holy orders, the other for his authority. And so his ring, by kissing his ring, we honor him as a bishop. By genuflecting, we honor him as having authority over us. And that's why we, in our diocese, we genuflect before our bishop. But in a different diocese, you genuflect before the bishop of that diocese and not before your own bishop, even in that diocese. Now, left knee, right knee, liturgically, there's no, it's never stated liturgically that you genuflect on your left knee. Back when people genuflected more socially, there were some pretty rigorous rules. Like for a proposal, when a man proposed to a woman, he would genuflect on his left knee. When my mother was growing up, we didn't do this, but when my mother was growing up, when the priest came into the room, everyone stood up, good afternoon, Father, and boom, down on their left knee. Culturally, socially, you can do that. There's no liturgical requirement, absolutely. And I promise you, if you ever have the opportunity to genuflect before your ordinary, he's not going to much care. He will probably feel awkward about the fact that you're genuflecting before him, because the custom is disappearing, unfortunately. So,
it used to be in, I guess in old Europe, Catholic Europe, that people would genuflect for their king, maybe even for their lord. right? A lesser nobility. I don't remember how all of that works. It's what is it? It's the king, and then they're earls, and then they're dukes, and then earls, and I don't remember all of it. But they would genuflect even for their local feudal lord. So people who are living in a country with a king who presumably is not going to be Catholic, what would you say about that? That's certainly appropriate, isn't it?
All authority comes from God. And to genuflect before authority as a social custom is to genuflect before the authority that person has, which comes from God. Even for the worst dictator, all authority comes from God. I mean, our Lord said that to Pontius Pilate. You have no power over me, but what comes from God. To Pontius Pilate, my goodness. So, yeah, it's fitting. It's fitting.
What about genuflection when the Blessed Sacrament is carried in procession? We see a lot of people doing that. What and when is appropriate?
So if the procession passes you and you're for some reason or another not part of the procession, a double genuflection is fitting. This happens often when Father's going to make a sick call after Mass, and he'll come through the social hall because that's the only way he can get out the door. And so you'll hear the tinkle of the bell. When you hear that bell, you know immediately what's going on your knees before the great God. And Father will come through, and typically they'll have a candle and a server will be ringing the bell. Absolutely. By the way, in a sick call, when Father shows up at your home, the first thing you do when he walks in the door holding the Blessed Sacrament is to kneel down and give a double genuflection.
What about when the priest, during the asperges, when the priest passes through the church, what's appropriate there? I see people bowing, I see people genuflecting, I see people doing all sorts of, blessing themselves. What's the appropriate conduct there?
So there's nothing in the rubrics that say, you will often hear, bow for a priest, genuflect for a bishop. It's customary in some places. It's not wrong. There's nothing in the rubrics that say you should do that. You do, however, when either in the asperges or in the vidiaquam at the Gloria Patri, when Father stops to say the Gloria Patri, that's the minor doxology. And so a bow and then erect. But that's the only thing that's prescribed in the rubrics.
What about a cardinal? What if there's a certain cardinal that travels widely and does traditional things for people? Most American Catholics are not regularly going to see a cardinal. I guess if you're in New York and LA, maybe that's different. But when a cardinal shows up and is doing traditional things, is there a different rule for cardinals in that case?
I'm not sure, except to say that the principle is a cardinal is actually not a level of order nor of authority. It's an honorific. So a cardinal can be an archbishop, so he would be a cardinal archbishop. A bishop, so he'd be a cardinal bishop. In bygone days, a cardinal could also be a priest, so he'd be a cardinal priest. And believe it or not, there were cardinal deacons in the past. Now it's reserved exclusively for bishops and archbishops. And I know there are different rules socially, but I don't know that there are. I'm pretty sure they're not liturgically.
There was one priest, cardinal priest. I think there might still be one cardinal priest. That's a little bit of a trivia question. We gotta
we'll look into that.
Okay. And last thing, we're way over time. I appreciate your generosity. Last thing, what about the Pope? If you had the opportunity to meet the Pope, or he passed in front of you, or he was driving by in the Pope mobile and he blessed you, what's the proper conduct there?
So if he blesses you, he will bless you as a bishop, and of course the bishop's blessing is different, but he has authority over you. So if you happen to meet him at a party, go ahead and genuflect and kiss his ring.
That sounds like the safe way to go. Okay, one final thing, as we talked about at the outset, we got a lot of feedback, comments, a little bit of hate mail. There's one here I think we wanted to address.
Yeah, let me ask you, Jeff. Let me ask you. So someone watched and learned apparently, but had some apprehensions. Said, I want to like this series implicitly, but I don't. Respectfully, I'm glad it was done respectfully. You didn't seem to follow a clear plan of what you wanted to impart. Perhaps this will improve. I hope so too. You have left me with more questions than you answered. So I'm going to ask you to comment on that first, Jeff. You have left me with more questions than you answered, hoping for improvement.
Well, I will say that you and I are just two guys trying our best who are volunteering here. Neither one of us does Patreon.
You didn't get your check?
I've yet to get all the checks. You know, we're doing our best. We're not going to be perfect, obviously, but there has been some forethought into this based on our experience in the pews and with families. In my case, I've been married 27 years and I have 14 children, and so I'm drawing upon that. Plus I was raised Catholic, and so I'm trying to bring that. And Jim, much longer in the faith, and you've been traditional your whole life. So we are drawing upon a not. It's not a short time in the church, right? We didn't just convert a few years ago, and now we're here to tell you how to be a good Catholic. We're just
how these things are done.
Yeah, we're drawing upon, let's call it, substantial experience, and as not just as practicing Catholics, but husbands and fathers. Jim, you've got a good sized family. Is it 6 kids? Is that right?
5 kids.
5. You've raised those children in the faith. You've got a lot of experience. So we are trying to systematically draw upon that with, I would not say the official approval of any priest or authority, but I know certainly the priests that I'm close to, who come from a variety of backgrounds and are in different jurisdictions and orders. They know what we're doing here. We seek their approval, their general guidance for, hey, are we on the right path here? So we do want to help you, but I suspect there's always going to be somebody that's a little bit disappointed by what we're doing here.
Sure, and it's not that there's not room for improvement. I mean, I've made several changes after we did the first episode, which was really kind of a pilot. I mean, I definitely got some better sound. I put some lights up, and we want to make this as good as we can make it. We want to make it viewable. We want to make it interesting, but mostly we want to make it informative. And in fact, the same commenter last time asked questions that we already had planned, and then subsequently did address in this episode. So if you watch this on YouTube and you would like specific questions answered, I urge you to, or on the various Facebook groups where we publish this, ask your questions. We take them very seriously. We mean to educate. We're not beyond reproach. We're not beyond criticism. We're doing this because we see it as absolutely a service, and we do it ad maiorem Dei gloriam.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're way over time. I'm now sure somebody's going to complain that, Jim, you were too long-winded.
It won't be the first time.
I apologize for that. Okay, folks, next week I'm sure we'll have more questions, but next week we're going to get into the principle of singularity and what that means. And we'll also talk some more about folding hands and get into some other of the more advanced things for the liturgy. And it's perfect timing, right? This is Lent. So we want to be disciplining our bodies as well as our intellect and our will at the same time. Jim, anything else to say?
No, just thank you, Jeff, and God bless you all.
All right. God bless you. Thank you for being with us. And we'll be back for episode 3 next week.